Morning, everyone, and welcome to the July monthly presentation of the Institute for Historical Study. We are an organization largely based in the Bay Area and interested in history generally, although there is a focus on California and the West. I'd like to particularly welcome members of the George Orwell Society, who are mostly from England, who are joining us today to hear Peter Stansky, one of their members and one of our most respected members of the Institute, talk about George Orwell. Peter is now retired. He has taught British history at Stanford for many years, as well as holding other posts, administrative posts. He is educated at Yale, Cambridge, and Harvard, and has written extensively on, among other personalities, George Orwell, whom we will be talking about today. So without further ado, Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I seem to have just a small picture of myself, but let's see. Anyway, you can hear me. I'll start with several apologies. I don't have any visuals. I feel all lectures nowadays are expected to have visuals, but I'm a sort of from a pre-visual era, and also to cope with it technically would be a challenge. So there are no visuals. I apologize very nicely. There's one or more members from the Orwell Society, and I suspect that anything that I have to say they will know already. But apologies to them. And the other thing I might warn you, I get these messages saying my internet is unstable. So what does happen occasionally is it freezes. But if it does freeze, don't go away because it does. The freeze tends to happen for about a half minute or something, and then it comes back. I hope very much it won't happen, but I felt I should mention that.
Peter, before you go any further, one technical note I forgot. Would everybody please mute themselves, except for Peter, of course?
Yes, well, I won't mute
Please mute
myself.
yourselves.
And I guess my third apology is I'm going to begin with a brief biographical statement about how my connection with Orwell, which is basically what I've written in the introduction to the Socialist Patriot, the very short book that I published with Stanford in 2023. But I thought it might be of interest just to give you the background. My parents were members of the Book of the Month Club, and as probably 1984 was selected as a book, and so I read the book. I think when it was first published in 1949, when I was a senior in high school, and then when I was an undergraduate at Yale. I was very interested in, I became more and more interested in England and also growing up with him listening to the wonderful songs of the Spanish Civil War, sung by the 𝘚𝘩𝘦 Battalion and Paul Robeson. I was very interested in Spanish Civil War. And somebody, you should mute yourself, whoever's speaking. I can't see who it is, but so I wrote a senior essay about four English men who had been involved in the Spanish Civil War: Julian Bell and John Cornford, who were killed in the war; George Orwell and Stephen Spender. And then years later, I published a book with my co-author, William Abrams, Journey to the Frontier, about Cornford and Bell. The initial plan was to write about all four, but it seemed Bell and Cornford had been killed, and so that was a discrete volume. It was never, and then Orwell was to be part of it, but I was never interested in writing about Orwell post Spanish Civil War. It was never intended to be a full biography. And but then, as I discuss in the preface, uh, we had a great dispute, which I could go into detail about it, and I may in the preface with the second Mrs. Orwell, if I may say so, the dread Sonia Brownell, and she thought we were writing a biography. It became a biographical study, but it was done without her approval. And with initially, when we started on the project, she wasn't very interested in Orwell, and she encouraged us. And in fact, she urged us to be in touch with Orwell's sister, Avril, and she was very comparatively uninterested in Orwell. But the contracts, the copyright arrangements were renegotiated because of the American rule then of 28 years. And suddenly Orwell became much more central. And of course, she and Ian Angus uh, published the very valuable, uh, before the Peter Davison volumes, the very valuable 4 volumes edition. We were banned from the archive, but at that point, the archive didn't have original material. It was a wonderful collection of the fugitive articles and pieces that Orwell had written, so it was very useful. But in fact, before the ban, I had worked in it. And there was Orwell manuscript material elsewhere, at the Berg in New York, at the Ransom in Texas, etc. So there was enough material to publish the first 2 books about Orwell. Uh, um, The Unknown Orwell, which took him up through the publication of his first book, Down and Out Maris in London, and his use of the pseudonym, and then the second volume that took him through his experience in Spain. We never intended to write a complete biography. And now, of course, there have been, which I'll allude to later, there have been numerous, about 5 or 6 biographies, as well as innumerable books about Orwell, which is fine, which is great. But there's no shortage of writings about Orwell. Okay, I think that's enough biographical, but you can ask me any questions, of course, that you wish. A second, my title, George Orwell Today, may be a bit deceptive in that I'm not going to talk about what Orwell would think about present situations, because rather I think that Orwell's insights and brilliance and so forth, reading Orwell can be very illuminating and helpful, both wonderful in itself, but also helpful in looking at present day situations. But what I don't think is a good idea, but of course many people do it, what would Orwell say about X? And I think that frequently tends to be tendentious. Most famously, when in 1984, in a way, it's rather interesting. In 1984, when not surprisingly, there was a tremendous amount of Orwell activity, including lots of conferences, and then also notoriously, if I remember the chronologically correctly, at that point, Norman Podhoretz wrote a notorious article and commentary, I think it was, his journal, about how Orwell was sort of would have supported the United States in Vietnam. There's always been that aspect of the right wing, particularly in America, supporting Orwell. I believe the John Birch Society has 1984 as its telephone number or something like that. Uh, and Orwell, of course, as you probably know, had to issue a refutation very shortly before he died, saying, I'm a supporter of the Labour Party, and the use of the right of 1984 is totally unjustified. Um, and then, but Christopher Hitchens, the wonderful polemicist, was the main figure in refuting the Podhoretz point of view. But then ironically, perhaps in 2003, the 100th anniversary of Orwell's death, um, birth, not death. There was another dispute about what Orwell would have thought about in the Iraq War, and there, ironically, Christopher Hitchens, who by that point had moved to the right, uh, and in fact, he was supposed to give a talk about Orwell at Stanford, which I with a symposium on Orwell, and then he sent me this dramatic email saying, "I'm embedded in Iraq, so I can't come." And by that time, he was supporting the right wing position, and he was refuted by Stephen Collini and Louis Menand. So it was rather ironic that Hitchens should be involved in both disputes, but on opposite sides. So I think that's enough to say about what I'm not talking about Orwell today. But now I'll move to, I should watch the time a bit. Oh, well, there's tons of time, and I don't plan to talk for a full 40 or so minutes. But so there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions. Um, Orwell today, what do I mean by that? So what I would like to discuss is the state of Orwell studies and approaches to Orwell now. And ironically, I think it's a wonderful irony that I don't know whether Orwell would have appreciated. As you all probably know, Orwell, particularly 1984, has never been better known and has never sold better. And you see the adjective or the verb Orwellian in the papers more than ever. Orwell has never been better known, so many years after his death, than he is now. And the obvious reasons for that, well, as you probably all know, when 1984 and Animal Farm were published, they became very part of their great appeal was as documents in the Cold War, as anti-Russian documents, which indeed they are. And then subsequently, I don't know, subsequently. Um, Now, 1984, a major reason it sells better is it sells so well and is taken as so such an important book. Has basically nothing to do with the Cold War, but rather two things. Orwell's sales are deeply indebted to Donald Trump, because Trump, with his alternate facts and his big brotherism and so forth, is sadly, and we trust we pray, ultimately unsuccessful big brother figure. Uh, he's been tremendously helpful for interest in Orwell and Orwell's sales. And secondly, I mean, Orwell was wonderfully prescient in 1984 on the power of computers. And though, obviously there's not AI in his books, but there's a sort of prediction of AI and the intrusiveness and the ability of, Winston Smith's job is to rewrite the past, to conform to what Big Brother wants or the establishment wants. And the computer and AI and so forth ability to alternate alter the past and to is again a great explanation of one of the crucial explanations for the prescience and the popularity of particularly 1984. But then, as I think I indicated in the brief description, the paradox that's now true, although it hasn't hurt Orwell in terms of sales, Orwell's uh, 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 I'm on Zoom. I can't talk. Um, I'm sorry. The uh, Orwell's reputation as a person, in many senses, has never been lower. And I'll go into that. I'll go into that for the rest of what I have to say. In many ways, he was overblown as a person. And one of the major culprits, and of course, John Roden has written a whole book, which I read years ago, Politics of Reputation, about reputation. But I haven't reviewed it. But in many ways, the great literary critic, ironically, the first Jewish professor in the English department at Columbia, Lionel Trilling, and probably many of you know, or maybe not, Homage to Catalonia, when it was originally published, because of its anti-communism, and a lot of people feeling that Russia had to be supported because it was the only country, virtually the only country except for Mexico to a degree, that was helping the loyalists in Spain. Uh, Homage Catalonia sold very badly and was not very well extensively reviewed, or it was when it was originally published. But then, thanks to the Cold War, because it was such a powerful anti-communist document and such a wonderful book, in my view, it was republished in 1952, and I have my copy that I bought then, again, incidentally, with its front page ripped off, because its front page was the Spanish Republican flag. And I used it when I went into Spain, when Franco was still in power, to trace Orwell's steps. And I thought when I went through customs, I went by car, but I thought that to have a Spanish Republican flag on a person was not wise, so I ripped it off cowardly. And then, ironically, driving along, I was stopped by a Guardia Civil. I thought, oh my God, I'm in trouble. And he wanted a lift. And I was in a tiny Volkswagen. I said, there's no room. Anyway, that's incidental. But anyway, the important thing is that Trilling, in that introduction, I think made a serious mistake. So some may not agree with him, but a famous moment where he says a graduate student came to see me. In fact, who was Stephen Marcus, who went on to become a very distinguished literary critic, but not particularly about Orwell. A graduate student came to see me, and we talked about Orwell, and we said to one another, Orwell was a man of virtue. Now, you might argue in some senses he was, But the implication was that somehow, and it was supported by his wonderful belief and hope for human decency. But the implication of that word is, I think, erroneous in terms of Orwell. So he's a brilliant writer, a wonderful writer, a very important writer, but in many ways, I don't know if Les will agree. In many ways, he was an ordinary English bloke. As he said of himself, he was a member of the lower upper middle class, which means he's a member of the upper middle class family, but without money. And he had, in spades, you might say, he had the ordinary, alas, ordinary prejudices of many members of the English middle class and upper class, maybe less the working class. And to a degree, and it's very hard to assess that, but to a degree, he was certainly anti-Semitic, homophobic, and misogynist. And but how deep that was, how, it's obviously not attractive, but how deep it was in his personality, how deep it is in English society is one of the things I'm interested in, but I think it's very, very difficult to assess. But to call somebody who is undoubtedly, say, down and out in Paris and London, and in other writings, he had these characteristics, so they're disconcerting and fascinating to discuss, but also very difficult to come to a final assessment. But the issue, as some of you may know, has become more intense because there's been the recent publication, which I'm sure Les is well deeply familiar with, by an Australian writer, Anna Funder. She wrote a highly regarded book, which I have read, about the Stasi, and then she wrote a second book about Orwell called Wifedom. And in it, its main theme is that Orwell mistreated his wonderful first wife, Eileen. Uh, and of course, inevitably, I can be seen as somewhat defensive, but it's also, in a way, somehow slightly amusing. I'm attacked along with other, and we're labeled with that dread term, members of the patriarchy. I'm attacked along with the other male biographers. All the biographers, I think, actual biographers of Orwell have been male, although there's a wonderful biography which Anna Funder more or less ignores of Orwell's wife, Eileen, by Sylvia Trump. Um, we're attacked. We're using that dread word. We're attacked as members of the patriarchy and accused. Excuse me, I need some water. Um, we're accused of ignoring Eileen and our contribution, which is untrue. I mean, all of them discuss Eileen, and in fact, in the second book, Orwell, The Transformation, there's a whole section of the book called Eileen, and Eileen is not ignored by the biographers. I think it's a very unfair contribution, accusation. But of course, I'm biased, so maybe I should, what I say should be taken with a grain of salt. The other thing the book is full of errors. I think there may have been a second edition in which the errors are corrected, but it's full of errors about Orwell. And also, and I don't know what others think, it's admittedly written in this comparatively new genre, which I have mixed feelings about, known as creative nonfiction. And what Anna Funder does, which I think is totally unjustified, she literally makes up conversations between Eileen and Orwell that she writes in the book, as well as including discussions of her own marriage. That's what creative nonfiction is. And I think it's a genre that has a lot of dangers and is particularly true in this case. I think it's fair to say that Orwell was, uh, to a degree, a misogynist. But also in his defense, Eileen, I think, was very willing and incredibly helpful and incredibly important to Orwell. And also, she was willing to do all the work, which I think was the assumption in the 1930s of most English husbands, that she was perfectly willing to do all the work in the household. But Funder attacks Orwell for not being more helpful, and I think he was being conventional. I mean, maybe he should have been more helpful as a man of virtue, but actually to make it a major accusation, I think is unfair. Um, uh, and also, they decided to have an open marriage or agreed to have an open marriage. And there's no question that Orwell had a series of flings. And when they went to Marrakesh, he said to Eileen, I want to go to a Moroccan prostitute. And she, as far as we know, didn't take. There's a thought. There's a possibility that she had. It's sometimes said that she had an affair with George Kopp, who was Orwell's commander in Spain. But even that is not certain. But it's certainly clear that Orwell had flings with secretaries of the BBC, etc. And then also he was rather classic in the sense that of his homophobia, and he wrote nasty things about what he called the pansy poets. But then Auden and his circle. But then, ironically, he also fit into the cliche of some of my best friends, in that he became a very good friend and fond of Stephen Spender, who was one of the pansy poets. He and Dak had attacked. And then also, in terms of anti-Semitism, he fitted into that cliche, some of my best friends, in that he was, of course, his first publisher was Victor Gollancz, who was Jewish. And then, because of political reasons, Gollancz ceased to be his publisher. His second publisher was Frederick Warburg, who was Jewish. And then he was the co-editor in the very important series of books, Lion and the Unicorn being such an important example of so-called searchlight, very pamphlets, short books. And his co-editor there was Tosco Fievel. who was Jewish. These unattractive, but there's no question. But Anna Funda, in the view of the Orwellians, and of course we're biased, but I think we're also, if I may say so, accurate, grossly exaggerated. But as I say, to call him a man of virtue, as Trilling did, is perhaps not quite the right. I haven't had a chance to look again at John Roden's book. I can't quite remember what position he takes about all this. But a man of virtue is not. He's a man of genius. He's a man of incredible importance. He's a great writer. But it seems to me that man of virtue is not quite an accurate term. On the other hand, these anti-Semitism, homophobia, misogyny are hardly attractive characteristics. But how significant they are. They have some significance, obviously, but how significant they are in terms of understanding Orwell. I mean, they're part of the total picture of Orwell. But as I say, we have this paradox that he's never been more highly regarded and popular as a writer, and he's never been more lowly regarded as a personality. But in my view, it hasn't destroyed him. Would that he were living at this hour. So I think I'll stop. And of course, I hope people have things comments or questions that I might try to answer.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I'll open the floor to questions. Peter, you're in charge of that. Please, if you have questions, remember to unmute yourselves. And it would be helpful if, having asked the question and discussion, mute yourself again so that we don't have a lot of background things. So, Peter, I see Felicia has her hand up. So I'll turn to Felicia first, and then Peter, you can run whatever you want.
Thank you. That's Felicia 𝘠𝘠𝘦, by the way, not Felicia. It's a double name like Mary Jane.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The print's a little small on my screen.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Of course, Peter is right that Orwell has manifested homophobia, anti-Semitism, and misogyny, but people never seem to call attention to the fact that he's also manifested ableism. And this is extremely important in 1984, where O'Brien exposes and convinces Winston that he's not the guardian of the human spirit because of what he looks like. The curvature of his spine was astounding. The thin shoulders were hunched forward so as to make a craggy cavity in the neck. The craggy neck seemed to be bending forward under the weight of the skull. As a guess, he would have said it was the body of a man of 60 suffering from some malignant disease. But of course, a man of 60 suffering from some malignant disease could be the guardian of the human soul. Why not? I mean, so that's another type of prejudice he has. Notice that it's also manifested in a hanging, absolutely wonderful essay in most respects, where there's all this emphasis about the life of a man being ended who's in perfect health, as if it weren't as outrageous if he hadn't been in perfect health.
Yes, I don't have any comment on that aspect. But we good point.
Thank you.
Goodness, no thoughts?
Yes. Yes. Whoa.
Peter, go ahead.
Peter.
Yes. Just as a sort of footnote on thou shouldst be living at this hour, it was hard not to think of the windmill in Animal Farm when the reflecting pool went south. and the wreckers had been at work. What I wanted to ask is, how do you feel about the controversy over Orwell's list of suspects? And to what extent do you think that reflects his struggles in getting published when the communists and fellow travelers were doing their best to keep him out of print?
The list is a problem. And where was it? In maybe the Orwell Journal. Some of us were asked about Orwell, and I was one of the questions was, "What would you like to ask Orwell if you could?" And I think my answer was I would want him to try. How would he justify the list? I think the list was fundamentally a bad thing. It wasn't nice. It wasn't a nice thing to do, to list these people. The thing is, it was also in a way unnecessary. And maybe he did it because he was dying. So he did it when he was in the Cotswolds Sanatorium. He had done earlier list, and this was a friend of his, what was her name, Inez Holden or somebody else, who was working in the semi-secret office, in the Foreign Office, to plant anti-Soviet stories. And he initially submitted a list which was positive and had no nefarious implications of people he thought who should be asked to write. And he loved making lists, so maybe he gave into that proclivity. So he decided to write a list of people who shouldn't be asked. And it was quite unnecessary because, and one of them, of course, included a person who was in the Home Office, I think, who turned out to be a Soviet spy, Smollett. But the virtually all the people on the list wouldn't have been asked. I mean, they were obviously fellow travelers or sympathetic or less nefarious, but they were clearly people who were not going to write anti-Soviet things, whatever they might think. They might have doubts about Russia, but they weren't going to publicly attack Russia, and the Foreign Office people knew that. It was obvious. So sadly, the list was totally unnecessary, and he should have, even if it was necessary, he shouldn't have written it. So I think it was a serious mistake of judgment, perhaps influenced by his being so ill. But we have to live with it, and of course, when knowledge of it became more public, there was a lot of, just in a way, justified Orwell bashing going on. But how to put it? It's an embarrassment for Orwell supporters and a plus for Orwell detractors. What else can I say?
Could I ask a further question? Is it possible to say of Orwell that he may not have been a man of virtue, but he was a man of virtues? And among those virtues were courage and a love of truth.
Oh, yes. Of course, as I say, he had many virtues. but we don't associate misogyny, anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
and things that a virtuous person should have.
I'm trying to remember, where does the anti-Semitism manifest itself?
Most vividly, if I remember correctly, and Les may know, down and out in Paris and London. He has lots of sort of nasty that Jew and so forth and so on, and it's sort of casual, but and it's not intense, but it's not nice. And I think, I mean, I couldn't, I don't know, the Peter Davison volumes are magnificently indexed in the final volume, the 20th volume. And I can't remember if there's an entry on anti-Semitism, but there might be. And I suspect that if you looked at his correspondence, I suspect that one would find sort of casual, I'm not sure, I haven't done it, that one would find casual, casual is the right word, anti-Semitic uh, remarks. But as I say, it seems to me this is part of an aspect of English society which is present. The terrible remark that was made years ago in some review where he was condemning too much interest in the Jews in England. David Cannadine said accurately, but in a way rather disgustingly, in a way, he said the country club is not the concentration camp. But you can see what he means. My other cliche about it, and again, this may be wrong, is the British love to, and again, the Les may not agree. The British seem to me to love to tease, and so they love to make teasing remarks, which generally have a little more hostility than they wish to admit. But my cliche about that is, which may not be accurate, that the British, and of course there are exceptions such as recent riots and so forth, and shootings in Britain and knifings. The British may say terrible things, but not do terrible things. And the Americans may not say terrible, but may do terrible things. And so there you have it. I see that Chris Angel wants to say something.
Yes, and that's actually following up on that theme. Thank you, Peter, for this. It's been really interesting to hear. But talking about Orwell and anti-Semitism, which something I've studied and talked to you about before. In 1945, kind of later in his life, he famously wrote this essay, Anti-Semitism in Great Britain. And in it, he at least partly turned kind of a light on his own past habits or his own anti-Semitism. And it was sort of critical of I guess, of English people and I think himself in terms of like what you're describing, sort of casual anti-Semitism. I mean, how much credit as a virtue should we give him for being willing to change his mind, at least in this one area? Is that something you see in his writing intellectually in general? And is that one of these virtues?
Oh, sure, yes. I should have reread the essay, but I didn't. And I should have mentioned in terms of Orwell's popularity, uh, there are these blockbuster volumes. This is the Oxford collection of about 40 or more essays, including one on anti-Semitism, which I read, but I can't quite remember what it says. And this course, fortunately, I have the Stanford University Library copy. This huge Oxford collection of essays. And again, it attests to the great popularity and interest in Orwell. If you want to purchase it, it's a mere $250. but and also I've written an essay as well as many others in a forthcoming volume from Routledge on many essays on Orwell, and then I think Cambridge University Press has two. I think has a collection of essays, if I remember correctly, on 1984, uh, and then a collection on a more general collection of essays. So, I mean, this is an example of the intense current interest in Orwell. Of course, Orwell has had his detractors before. Um, Well, if I remember correctly, again, I mean, who was Raymond Williams, I think, wrote a short series, and I think it went into several editions, a short little book on Orwell, and each one he became more critical of Orwell. And you know, until Animal Farm, he wasn't a famous writer. He was a moderately successful 1930s writer, but you know, he wasn't making that much money. But then his career took off, helped by the Cold War. There's no question. The Cold War was a great support in terms of his, and it's a term, as you may know, that he coined, that he used. He was the first to use in an essay. But of course, he died just as it was heating up. And as again, there's an interesting paradoxical point. The CIA paid translators, and the CIA did all it could to make 1984 more available, particularly in Eastern Europe. And you know, it's an interesting point. In a way, it's nefarious. On the other hand, isn't it terrific that this very terrific, great book, interesting book, should be more available to more people, even though the agency that's making that possible, one has concerns about. So it's all, you might almost say, it's an Orwellian paradox.
If I may ask you a question, Peter, there's a very good book about the CIA funding the making of the cartoon version of Animal Farm in 1955 called Orwell Subverted by Daniel Lieb. I wondered, did you ever talk to Daniel Lieb
No,
about,
no, no.
do you know the book?
I
Orwell
just know the
Subverted?
title. I haven't read it. No.
It both because of course both the 1955 version of Animal Farm and the 1956 version of 1984, the one with Edmund O'Brien, were both partly sponsored by the CIA, who both had the endings of both films changed from the book. At
There's
the
a
end,
he
at the end
gave
of Animal Farm, the animals revolt, and at the end of that they shot two endings to 1984 with Edmund O'Brien. In one of them, he loves Big Brother, as happens in the book, but in the other one, he gets a machine gun out and revolts before being shot down. So what you've actually got is literary critics in the CIA helping to rewrite classic literature.
they wanted to give it the happy ending, so to speak. Of
Well,
course,
more in line.
there's a long time debate uh, about whether or not uh, Orwell gave whether Orwell gave a happy ending to 1984, because in the appendix about Newspeak, it's written as if Big Brother and so forth and the regime are in the past, but it's rather ambiguous. I don't think it's resolved whether Orwell wanted us to think that 1980 that it continued, or whether it somehow had been ended.
It's an interesting point. I actually saw a very good suggestion only the other day that even if the appendix is looking backwards, it could be looking backwards from another generation of party members, new versions of O'Brien in the future, so that there's actually nothing has changed and it's still as horrific as we saw. I don't see anybody else's hand up, so if I can ask another question. Your last complete book on Orwell was on Orwell and war.
Yes.
I wonder if you'd like to describe it. What were the wars that Orwell knew and that you talk about in that book?
Well, I think, and it's also the subject of, I've somewhat plagiarized myself shamefully in the Routledge essay. What I think is it discusses Orwell's relationship with the First World War, the Spanish Civil War, uh, the war itself, and the Cold War. And I think, if I may say so, I think it's most original contribution, I think, is that his connection with the First World War, where, of course, he was adolescent. He was born in 1903. And of course, there's a famous essay, as people know, that he wrote about his prep school days at St. Cyprian's. Such were the joys. But he was made a patriot, it seems to me, for better or worse. There was an officer corps, both at St. Cyprian's and Eton that he belonged to. He didn't have a choice. They were made to do it. And also, as I'm sure the Orwellians know, his very first publication is as a schoolboy, which his mother got into the Henley paper, was chastising those who didn't enlist. And if you are a coward indeed, I think is the line of it. So it seems to me that patriotism, and again, he differentiates wonderfully later on between patriotism and nationalism, in which, according to him, and I think it's accurate, patriotism is loving your own country. Nationalism is loving your own country and believing that every other country should be as you are. And he attacks that. And interestingly, I think this is so frequently forgotten. He didn't want to destroy the Soviet Union. He said it can exist. What I wanted not to be influential elsewhere. He was very much against its influence in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But obviously he hated how Russia behaved in the time of the Spanish Civil War. But he didn't want to destroy Russia. And in a way, I think if he was a nationalist, he would have wanted to. If he was a patriot, he didn't want to. But each chapter it's a very short little book published by the Stanford University Press. So I talk about his relationship with the First World War when he was very young, and his a cousin of his was killed in the very first months as an officer in the war of the First World War. So I think the First World War was very influential in shaping his character. But then obviously the other Spanish Civil War, the Second World War, and then the beginning of the Cold War are the subsequent chapters. But they've been more discussed. And not that the First World War has been ignored, but I think it's been, so to speak, comparatively ignored.
Peter,
could you talk a little bit about Orwell and language and his attitudes towards language and how he thought language should be used or used properly and disabused regularly?
Well, no, I don't think I have too much to say. I mean, what's the famous essay about political speech and escape words? He was a wonderful, it's one of his great influences. Not to use words, pompous words, for plainness, strength. He's a great stylist, and he was a great attacker on people using language to manipulate politics in the English language. Is not the name of the famous essay.
Yes,
So he was a great policer, good policeman of language, and that was a very important influence. Tangentially, the other influences, which again are not forgotten, but may not be given enough attention. He was a great influence on sociology, in the sense, he wrote these famous essays about boys' stories, and looking at literature, for British literature, for what it tells you about a society, which of course, it exists to an extent, but the whole, what Richard Hoggart and the Center of Birmingham University, etc. The political implications. I mean, he was wonderfully combined in that, I hope every word I've written, is on the behalf of politics or whatever. He was he was two things that you might think were could be in opposition: language as politics and language as art. And both of those things and their interaction were very important to Orwell. So to try and get us to write honestly and accurately, I think is a great legacy of Orwell, and what he thought about style in the service of truth, according to him. I don't know if that answers the question. Other thoughts?
I see that in the chat there is a link to your book on Orwell and War, which somebody just put up. So people might want to copy that.
Yes, well, people should read Orwell. And of course, there's the great 20 volume with one supplemental volume. Peter Davison, late Peter Davison. The first 9 volumes are Orwell's books, and then the second 11 volumes are everything that new things keep coming up. And as I say, now the Orwell archive at University College London has lots of original material, which it didn't have when in the 1960s. It had printed material, fugitive printed material. One of the again, it's not right. One of the great joys when I was initially working, investigating Orwell as an undergraduate at Yale, and Yale was very good about allowing, some universities don't, such as Harvard, if I remember correctly. Yale was very good in allowing undergraduates to go into the stacks of its library, and Orwell's essays Wade published what Inside the Whale, where with a few of his essays, but basically his essays and certainly his columns were not gathered together, and the periodical the journals that he published in, well, of course, would either be in the Yale stacks, and then I also did some research in the New York Public Library. Uh, and it was great fun to roam the stack. I mean, it was a task, it was a search to roam the stacks and find these few, which were then regarded as fugitive publications, because it wasn't, gradually. Well, the four volumes, which came out in 1968, edited by Sonia Orwell and Ian Angus, were very useful. But before that, a lot of these essays were all over the place. Felicia Lume has something to say.
Karen, you have your hand up. Unmute yourself, please.
Sorry about that. Okay, am I now unmuted?
No, I called Karen. You're second. You'll be
Oh,
next.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Karen will be first. She was up first.
Yes,
All right.
you are unmuted. Go ahead, Felicia Lume, speak.
Wait, I thought you had called on Karen and you wanted her to speak.
Unmute. Let's
She had
see.
to unmute herself.
That do it?
Yes,
No.
you are.
Karen Offen, and as you know, Peter, I am not a British history scholar or an Orwell scholar, but I am very interested in what Orwell's reactions may have been to the writings, either novels or political tracts of Virginia Woolf and Winifred Holtby, especially in the 30s.
Well, I think I've written an essay in maybe one of my William Morris to Sergeant Pepper, or 20 Years On. Orwell tended to be, to his shame, in my view, he tended to be rather snotty about Bloomsbury, and he also tended to be rather snotty about William Morris. And of course, these are my great interests of mine. Um, I don't think he read them seriously. I don't. I can't remember. And again, the index of the Peter Davison, the 20 volume would tell you. If he has comments about Virginia Woolf, I don't think. I think it would be very much in passing. He probably regarded them as sort of upper class. Uh, well, I think he was, again, I don't know. I'm just thinking. I think he may have respected them. After all, Virginia Woolf was a well-known. The Woolfians tend to say Virginia Woolf was ignored until we came along, but that was untrue. Virginia Woolf was a highly respected, successful. I mean, she wasn't mad. She wasn't a bestseller, but she sold well, and she had a very successful literary career. And Leonard Woolf was very fond of pointing out that ultimately, since Virginia Woolf's books stayed in print, they ultimately sold better than the bestseller of whatever might have been the bestseller the year that she was published. But I don't think Virginia Woolf was a significant figure. And in any way, my hunch, which may be inaccurate, is that he would tend to be. I may have written about it a little. I can't remember, shamefully. I think he tended to be probably rather snotty, and regarded them as too too upper class. but that's all a guess. So I'm not really sure, but I think she certainly was not a significant figure for him.
Thank you.
Finish, Louis?
Okay, now I'm unmuted. I did want to refer to something Peter said about art in the service of truth for Orwell, where he began to quote that famous remark, every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I see it. And I wanted to stress that you've got to be an incredibly good fiction writer, like Orwell, to carry that off without being boring or polemic. In general, politically oriented fiction is apt to be extremely, didactic and tiresome. I write short stories. I would never dream of trying to do that. I'm just not good enough. So I do want to stress how much Orwell's talent made this sort of thing possible. The other thing I wanted to mention was where, at the outset, Peter mentioned Orwell being a sort of big brother figure. Rump being, I don't even use the actual word, a big brother figure. Rump may be aiming at that, but in fact, he's different in one important way. He's just ludicrous. People make fun of him. He calls himself a stable genius. Um, it's not just that Big Brother, people were not free to make fun of Big Brother in 1984. He's not sort of a figure of fun the way Rump is. I mean, Rump is sort of a ludicrous person. So that's an important difference.
Oh yeah. Yes, as I say, it's wonderful that Orwell is now, you might almost say, well, he became quite famous, but sadly, very much at the end of his life, and as I say, rather ironically, as a beneficiary of the Cold War. As you all probably know, Animal Farm was turned down not only by Golangs, but famously by T.S. Eliot, who, of course, was a right-wing figure. But he said, the war was still going on. And he said, I'm not going to, the two sort of ironic things he said, ironic against him, I think, is that he was not going to publish, Faber and Faber was not going to publish anti-Russian book while the war was going on. And then, rather wonderfully, he said, well, the pigs seemed very clever, and it seemed to me it was sensible for the pigs to run things. Quite why I thought that. One's not quite sure, since it seems a rather peculiar position.
I see Peter has his hand up. You're muted. Peter, you're still muted.
Unmute. Yes. Okay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to quote you, Peter, of 60 years ago on the subject of English anti-Semitism. I had made some favorable remark about Ernest Bevin, the foreign secretary, and you made a face and said, oh, unpleasant person or nasty person, and quoted something he said in about 1947 when the DP camps were full of Jews trying to get to Palestine. And Bevin, pulling up one of the most well-known sneers about the Jews, said, the Jews are going to have to learn to stop pushing to the front of the queue. So,
Yes, well, Bevin was again, this is not really relevant, or maybe it is to Orwell. There was a rise of anti-Semitism during the war, and the Jews were accused of either escaping from the East End by taxi or pushing to the front of the queue to get into the shelters, and so obviously the people were aware of the horror to a degree of what was going on in Germany, and elsewhere during the war, but still there was a rise of anti-Semitism in Britain during the war. And also Bevan accused the United States, if I remember correctly, of supporting the founding of Israel because in order that the motive was to keep Jews out of the United States and to go to Israel instead. And of course, Britain was famously unhelpful in terms of both Britain and America. Well, again, it's not relevant to Orwell, but they could have done things to save Jews earlier. And Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State in the United States, there was, they made many more Jews could have escaped to the West if Britain and the United States had been more helpful. I don't know if Orwell comments on all that.
Anyone else have any comments to make on Peter, on Orwell, on the war, on anything? Okay, well, again, I'd like to thank the members of the Orwell Society for joining us, and you're welcome to come back anytime. Also, we have the Institute for Historical Study.org is our website. If you're thinking of joining us, anyone who has an interest in history is welcome to apply to join the Institute. Next month's monthly presentation, do this every third Saturday of the month, except December, excuse me. And we do it at 10 a.m. Pacific time so that people on the East Coast and in Europe can participate as well. On August 15th, we will be hearing from Anne Harlow on women artists in Berkeley from 1900 to 1920. And again, I'd like to thank Peter for his time and presentation and for all the discussions that followed. And we will see you all, hopefully, next month.
So thank you all for coming.